Good afternoon. Hello, Professor Johansson.
Hello, it's nice to hear from you.
Okay, today we've agreed to talk about electromagnetic radio frequency exposures. I've just been introduced to you this morning. You are an expert in the health effects of man-made electromagnetic fields and the functional impairment known as electrohypersensitivity, or abbreviated as EHS. You are a neuroscientist and longtime researcher from the dermatological unit of the prestigious Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, which for many of the viewers here in the United States may not realize that is the institute that awards the Nobel Prize in Medicine or Physiology. Professor, before I introduce myself to the future audience, would you please be so kind to give me a brief summary of your background and where you're speaking from and what you've been doing there in Mataró and Barcelona, Spain this week?
Yes, I started in 1972 my medical studies at the Karolinska Institute, and already in 1973 I started my research training at the Department of Histology, and I found myself engaged in studies regarding the central and peripheral nervous system, that is the brain, spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves and ganglia, and their content of various transmitter molecules in different cell types. And that led me to, after my PhD dissertation, to look much more into human beings, and we started a big project regarding human skin, and then we crossed the avenue leading to what you already mentioned, the functional impairment, electrohypersensitivity. I have been here this week in Spain, in Mataró, outside of Barcelona, giving lectures, meeting people, having discussions, and it has been extremely fruitful because, as you know, the kind of questions we are going to touch upon will be relevant to anyone on this planet. I get calls and invitations from every corner of our beautiful planet, and people want me to come there and talk about health effects of electromagnetic fields. And it could be about, for instance, children in wireless schools. It could be about cancer victims. It could be about electrohypersensitivity. It could be about neurological diseases. It could be about effects on insects, plants, bacteria, and so on. And I have also been honored to give lectures in the United States, for instance, in California, in San Francisco, at a very interesting meeting in 2009. And so I'm trying to cover as much as I can regarding these issues.
Okay. As Patricia, the coordinator of today's interview, may have told you, my name is Debra Digiacomandrea. I'm a semi-retired former newspaper reporter, the old-fashioned kind, and a former freelance writer. I live in St. Petersburg, Florida. I'm not presently actively writing, but a few years ago, I began to read books on the electromagnetic radio frequency issue as a personal interest after a very close physician friend of mine warned me to stay away from microwave ovens and mobile phones. He was similar to two of the fellows that attended your recent 5th Paris Appeal Congress, in that he treated people for chemical sensitivities and also was an expert in chelation therapy to remove heavy metals and toxins from the body. Now, I don't have your scientific background, but we are similar in that we are both from the same age. We grew up in the 1950s and the 1960s, and we probably heard warnings back then about not sitting too close to the television set when we were little. We probably didn't know at the time about the military soldiers who suffered from radar sickness or other illnesses due to wartime exposures of radio frequencies and radar. And frankly, the media and the government did talk about it much here in the United States, except for some university and Department of Defense studies, I believe. I first heard about the electromagnetic exposures in the late 1970s here in the United States at the newspaper where I was working. Because in the old days, we had the video display terminals, the cathode ray tubes, and they were warning pregnant women not to sit in front of them for too long due to a possible miscarriage risk. Unfortunately, they were not warning us also about the high-powered two-way walkie-talkie radios that we carried to communicate with the newsroom. So, thousands of miles away from my Florida newsroom, there you were in Sweden in the late 70s, early 80s, beginning to study the screen dermatitis issue. Can you tell me, why did you choose that issue of all the topics that you could research over your career, and what did you discover?
Well, I will be happy to do that. And before, it's very interesting that you touch upon the radar damages, for instance, in military personnel. Actually, in Sweden, there was a huge number of scientific reports that were published in official scientific journals, like in the 1950s and early 60s, and they laid a very strong foundation for the conclusion that microwave and radiofrequency exposures are not good for you at all. But for some odd reason, this research completely disappeared and vanished somewhere in the mid-60s and were not revitalized until in the early 1980s. And the reason that I started to be interested in this was that I actually did something that I very, very rarely do. Namely, I listened to a radio program one evening in my laboratory, and it was at 8 o'clock, I remember that, and I was about to turn off the radio because I couldn't really concentrate with the radio program in my ears. But then someone talked about women particularly, but also men, having started work with these new personal computers with these big cathode ray tubes, and they were starting to report skin problems, skin rashes, irritations, and redness, sensation of heat and warmth. And the woman that was interviewed, she was from the trade union in Sweden. Her name is Kajsa Wedin, and she asked for expertise in neurology. And I'm not a clinical neurologist, but I work in the neurosciences. So I thought, well, close enough, and it sounded very simple to investigate these skin alterations. And I also, of course, knew that we had built a very good foundation regarding normal, healthy skin. We knew quite a lot about it. So I thought, well, we could take skin biopsies. And we met with this woman and also a physicist from Göteborg on the west coast of Sweden. And they came to Stockholm. And yeah, funny enough, that's the reason why we are talking with each other today, because that was really the start with the investigations. And one should remember, at that time, at least in Sweden, there was a huge interest from various persons and organizations. So for a few years we had money, we could do various investigations. We studied both normal healthy skin, but also skin from people with what I coined the screen dermatitis phenomenon that we today call electrohypersensitivity. And but at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, something happened, I would say, and the flow of money quickly ceased, and it became more and more difficult to investigate the similar type of persons who in parallel to this have grown dramatically in number. And I remember at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s somewhere, I had a guest from the People's Republic of China. It was a clinical dermatologist. And I was sitting working with micrographs that we had taken in our fluorescence microscopes. And she came into the room and asked me what I was doing. And I stupidly, said, well, this is something you have never heard about. This is something that we are dealing with here in Sweden. There are persons sitting in front of computer screens getting skin irritations. And she has said, no, that's very common in China too. So I immediately realized that you do find it everywhere. And as you pointed out, the very first cases that were reported, they came actually from United States and Norway. And then they were followed by cases from various countries, including then Sweden and the People's Republic of China.
Very interesting. Is this screen dermatitis still an issue, or is it worse, or has it evolved into other skin issues, allergic reactions, or system-wide immune problems?
Well, at that time we concentrated very much on the cutaneous issues, and to be honest, we sometimes kind of forgot to even ask people what kind of other symptoms they had. But later on we became a little more scientific, I would say. So we collected in a study all the symptoms that were reported, and they do have symptoms from more or less the entire body, although concentrated a lot on the skin, but they also have like heart palpitations, problems with breathing, they have problems with the gastrointestinal tract, immune system reactions, headaches, concentration problems, memory problems, etc. And in the beginning, I remember colleagues saying, oh, don't bother about that, that's so completely unspecific. But these are the classical signs of radiation damage from, for instance, ionizing sources like ultraviolet light, X-rays, and radioactivity from radioactive isotopes. And also they are very specific in the sense that they tell you that something is wrong in your body due to external exposure from radiation. And now, of course, we are not talking about ionizing radiation, but non-ionizing radiation, like radio frequencies, including microwaves. We have different types of long-range waves. We have power-frequent magnetic fields, etc. And more information and knowledge were collected. And today, of course, we see that the database that describes these phenomena contains probably more than 25,000 publications in peer-review-based scientific journals. And if you widen your horizon and include all kinds of biological effects, for instance, the attack sequences of sharks, the navigation systems of birds and so on, I know that there are more than 100,000 publications. So electromagnetic fields of natural type as well as artificial types do have impacts in biology and medicine, that's for sure. And when people try to say that this is just imagination or anything like that, you should never believe them. Just refer them to the peer-review-based scientific literature.
Okay. You brought up the other life forms, and I wanted to ask you, does this have something to do with the magnetite or some other gland or structure that are in, say, perhaps the bees, the sharks, the fish, the bird?
Well, you know, various animals use various organs, including the pineal gland, of course, but also other electromagnetic sensory organs. And the interesting thing is, I see that you sit in your kitchen, and I sit here in a municipality building, and probably exposed to something in the order of 10 volts per meter. But you know, a shark would easily sense 0.05 nanovolts per meter. It's even hard to understand how little it is. And they have done it for hundreds of millions of years. And when you swim with sharks, which I strongly recommend, by the way, it's very interesting and exciting, they will come to you and they will have sort of a serpent-like motion through the water. And they are then checking if you're alive or dead. And in the final meter, they decide whether to eat you or not. And then they use this extremely sensory organ, sensitive organ, and they are censoring the muscular activity and through its electromagnetic fields. And of course, human beings are not food for these sharks, so they turn away. But sharks are not very intelligent. So they will go in a bow out, come back again and again and again, but each time using such minuscule differences in electric fields. And the same goes, you know, for birds and insects and so on. They could sense differences in electric, magnetic, or electromagnetic fields that are even hard to measure for human beings.
Okay. Thank you. Can you tell me how and why you began studying the issues dealing with melanoma? And is there a connection between melanoma and the electromagnetic exposures? Was that increasing in Sweden and other parts of Europe?
That's also a very interesting project and question that you bring up. And it all started actually when the World Health Organization cancer classified so-called power-frequent magnetic fields, which is a long word for household electricity, and its association to childhood leukemia. And that was in the year 2001, and it was based on beautiful American research by Nancy Wertheimer and Ed Leeper in Denver. And they had looked upon power lines and association with clusters of cases of childhood leukemia. And they published in 1979 a classical paper in the journal Science, where they then produced the final results and showed that there was such an association. And a collaborator to mine, Örjan Hallberg, and myself, we then sat down and said, well, maybe there could be similar associations to other cancer forms. And in the meantime, now we are somewhere around 2002, 2003. Knowledge has, of course, also arisen regarding the association between certain brain tumors and the exposure to radio frequency fields, especially microwaves from mobile telephony, which, in a parenthesis, led up to the World Health Organization classifying also radio frequency fields, May 31st, 2011, and their association to certain brain tumors. But coming back then to malignant melanomas, which, by the way, is the most rapidly increasing cancer form in Sweden and in quite a few other countries. We have an increase in incidence, that is the number of new cases per year, which is in the order of 6%, which is really an epidemic development. And then we started to plot. You know, when I went to my basic science training, I had excellent training in medical statistics. And I remember particularly a woman who said to me that before you do anything, always plot your data so you can see them on a sheet of paper. And before I continue, I will say that I had, as a lecturer in experimental and clinical dermatology, I had often met medical and dental students, and I had talked about that the reason why Scandinavians got more and more skin cancer was because we got more and more money in the 50s. We were able to fly to the Mediterranean and expose ourselves to more and more sun, and 20, 30 years later on, people got skin cancers. But you know, when we start to plot the data, it turned out to be completely the opposite. And in layman terms, a patient with skin cancer first died, then he or she got the disease, and thereafter they went to the Mediterranean. So it was completely the opposite. It didn't match at all, you know. And I'm not ruling out the sun, not at all, but there was some other factor, obviously. And to make a long story short, then we started to plot against various environmental exposures, and our eyes fell upon the idea of body resonant fields. And in Sweden, and I know in many other countries, the best body resonant fields are the so-called FM radio bands, which have a frequency of about 100 megahertz, meaning that the half-wave length is 1.5 meters, meaning that you and I, we will sort of stick up into this ocean of electromagnetic signals, being exposed to their energies. And when we plotted this, we could see that for each country, when they turned on, they rolled out their FM radio system, then you also had initially what we call a prevalence-based mortality, meaning that people that were very ill in malignant melanomas quicker died. They were kind of executed by these very, very fun FM radio signals. And later on, you saw a similar incidence increase. And for each country, it made sense. We could even break down countries to landscapes or to counties or similar. And for the United States, we could break it down to your 50 states and see that it combined always in a straight line. So we wrote then a number of papers, and we have published, I would say, in the order of at least 10 in this particular field, checking more and more into details.
Very interesting. This sounds similar to something I read here in the United States. There's an epidemiologist, Sam Milham, perhaps you've met him. He found correlation with a rise in 20th century degenerative disease trends like cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, when we began putting electricity in homes. He also found increases in cancer with exposures to dirty electricity and or large numbers of cell towers or radar towers. And in particular, he pointed out Marin County, the area north of San Francisco, which I believe has the largest number, the highest rate of breast cancer in the United States, despite the fact that there are many professional, wealthy individuals who live there that can afford organic food and the best types of preventative medical care. So these similar correlations, is that something that you presented in a 2002 paper, Cancer Trends During the 20th Century, and you were showing that health issues were coinciding with, say, the introduction of radio in the 20s, FM radio in 1955, color TV in 1969, and then also the switch from analog to digital phones sometime in the late 90s.
Yes. And you are talking, of course, about Dr. Sam Milham, who has written a lot about this and very interesting papers and books. And maybe, you know, I mean, this is, of course, a hypothesis that needs to be further investigated. But maybe we are not talking about rocket science at all. Maybe by spraying people with astronomically high levels of energy compared to natural background, you will feed cells, and some cells, they will actually feel quite well about that. There is a huge number of studies showing that the immune system initially is activated. It's trying to sort of fight off, but in a happy way, you know. It looks very good, it's very active, but after some time it deteriorates, and it deteriorates rapidly, and that could in itself explain all the things that you mentioned, the dramatic increases in various cancer forms, prostate cancer, breast cancer, and also increases in diabetes, etc. And again, I want to point out that we do not rule out all other confounders. Not at all. I mean, the whole lifestyle factors must be investigated and corrected, and that goes for Sweden and United States and Spain and everywhere, you know. We are living quite artificial lives. And you also mentioned breast cancer, which unfortunately is on the rise, not only in the United States, but also in other countries. And when you treat breast cancer, you use a chemical called tamoxifen. I'm sorry, I just got something in my nose. Tamoxifen, and the treatment with tamoxifen is effectively hindered when you expose persons to electromagnetic fields. So maybe they don't get breast cancer, but you stop the effectiveness of the most common treatment, meaning that the woman still will die.
Oh. Okay. The media, the mainstream media here in the United States, doesn't seem to pay attention to this electromagnetic radio frequency issue. But since you've just been talking about the breast cancer, I will bring up that recently, within the last year, in the mainstream media, there were cases reported of younger women in their 30s and 40s, and also several 21-year-old women who developed breast cancer without any other factors believed that could have influenced it, except for the fact that they were carrying their mobile phones in their undergarments, and the tumors were determined to be in the shape of the cell phone, in a pattern and in a location not usually found. Now, is that something that has also happened there in Europe?
Yes, unfortunately it is, and you know, both in the United States and in Europe, you can buy as a woman a bra with a special pocket to put your mobile phone into, and I just sort of scream when I see that, and I scream similarly high when I see people with baby prams with a small baby in it, and they are throwing their mobile phone or tablet down because it's convenient to have it while they're pushing the baby in front of them. And I want to tell them, don't do that, you know. This exposure is just gigantic, and people don't quite understand the levels of exposure we are talking about, neither the microwaves nor the power frequent magnetic fields. You know, a small mobile phone, that equals several electric train engines, and no father or mother in the world would throw several electric train engines down to a baby, but they do it without even realizing it. And as we said before, compared to natural background, the exposure levels, when we talk about microwaves for wireless telecommunication, that's just understood in biblical terms, you know. It's enormous exposures. And I have also today heard about similar cases regarding, for instance, kidney tumors, when a woman carry their mobile phone on their hip. So my recommendation is to not carry it at all. Just avoid it because the risks are too high. And it's interesting also, I know in the United States you have a very clever expression, namely follow the money. And it's interesting to see that, for instance, from a legal liability point of view, the operators, the manufacturers, the world's insurance companies, the radiation protection authorities, as well as the World Health Organization, they have all completely abandoned ship. They do not take any form of responsibility at all. And when I was at the conference in London 2004, there were representatives of the operators, the manufacturers, and the insurance companies, top lawyers from UK, United States, and so on. And they all summarized that for them, and it was 2004 already, for them it was not a question about if there are harm to human beings. The question was only who is going to pay for it, and they said in unison they were not going to pay for it. And I think if you doubt some test tube experiment or some investigation using clinical epidemiology, follow the money. They don't doubt this at all. They have already repositioned themselves, and therefore when I'm contacted by American lawyers, because there are your biggest law firms in the United States, they are preparing for lawsuits regarding brain tumors, and they have realigned their aim. They are not aiming at the operators or the manufacturers. They are aiming at the American states, because that's the only level left, actually, from a responsibility point of view.
And could that be because the manufacturers and sellers of the mobile phones have put a warning in the fine print of the phones or the booklets that go with it?
Yes.
Telling people.
And also, you know, I mean, they are so completely aware of this. And I remember at this conference in London, these top barristers and lawyers, they said that the tobacco scandal, the Bapool scandal in India, and the Dow Corning breast implant scandal, they were really the last times when any corporate industry ever would be put at liability in a court of law. They have learned a lesson, and in all these licenses and agreements, they write very, very detailed that they do not take any responsibility whatsoever. And also, you know, the World Health Organization cancer classifying both the radio frequency as well as the power frequent fields. They clearly tell the consumers, back off, because we are backing off.
Well, that's very disappointing. I was holding out hope that perhaps when the legal system here in the United States began to get on board and filing the lawsuits, that might...
They will, but their target is not the manufacturers or the operators. The target is the American state, because like in Sweden and in Spain, the governments, parliaments, senates, congresses, whatever you call them, they are the ones responsible for the rollout. And it's interesting, like in Sweden, the telecom operators, they went to the Swedish parliament and said very nicely, is it all right that we whole body irradiate the entire population 24/7 wherever they are with something ... They didn't say the rest, namely that the World Health Organization has cancer classified. And the Swedish parliament said, yes, that's exactly what we want. We want to have a complete coverage of the entire population, because the European Union has decided that we should roll out this communication device. And hopefully, I mean, and I want to really stress this, hopefully you and I and others that are critical, we are completely wrong. It is actually safe. We should really go down on our knees and beg to God that it is safe. But that would also mean that in the order of 25,000 scientific papers and an endless number of books, articles, commentaries, letters to editors and so on, all at the same time must be completely wrong. And that has never, ever happened before in science. So it's a very small probability that it will be true this time. But I hope it is safe. But I guess then I will also believe in that Elvis Presley is still alive.
It's possible. Anything is
Well,
possible.
anything is possible, but hardly likely, I would say.
We've been talking about the cancers, and I wanted to switch and ask you, have you not also done studies regarding the thyroid gland? And I'm bringing this up because here in the United States, there are so many people, especially women, who take synthetic or artificial, synthetic or natural thyroid supplements. And for many years, we have sat, especially women in offices, in front of these computers. So I wanted to find out what you thought about that, if you have found associations between exposures to computer screens or electromagnetic radio frequencies and specific or some types of irregularities in the thyroid gland, whether it be in rats or humans or other life forms.
Yes, it started, you know, in Sweden. If we go back to the early 1980s, physicians, clinical doctors, started to try to explain these new screen dermatitis / electrohypersensitive people by saying that, and I quote, they were just postmenopausal women. But then men came along. Then they said that there were people with low education, and then professors, lawyers, doctors, and so on also became electrohypersensitive. And then they said, oh, it's people with a high education, actually. And they talked about imagination, and they even actually put the blame on you, because they talked about a mass media-driven psychosis when people make video calls or newspaper articles. Then others will start sensing that, well, maybe I'm a little bit electrohypersensitive too. And then we decided to solve this, but actually changing from human beings to rats. And as you know, rats, they do not watch television or computers, they don't listen to radio, they don't read newspapers or books. And still, when exposed to the very same types of exposures, they do get the exact same type of, for instance, skin alterations that we had shown in human beings. And also, unfortunately, I must say, they had quite dramatic changes at the cellular and molecular level in the thyroid glands, pointing to that this may be, again, mimicking a classical ionizing radiation damage when the thyroid is involved. But here we are talking about non-ionizing radiation, but still involving this critical organ. And therefore, as you say, when you have a population that you have to supplement with natural or synthetic hormones, and you place them in front of very strong radiation sources, maybe it's time for something that I have inaugurated, namely the Institute of Common Sense for Common Sense.
Thank you. Okay, let me also ask you, are the mobile phones, the Wi-Fi, the cell towers affecting our melatonin levels? And would that possibly be one reason why we have the rising cancer rates and the rise in breast cancer?
Again, a very interesting area. There are quite a number of papers, but I have to be honest and say that here the picture is not 100% clear. You can find publications not showing alterations, as well as publications showing upward or downward changes in the levels of melatonin. So here it's still an open question, but its connection, of course, to cancers cannot be ruled out, and also its connections to nighttime sleep cycles or the whole 24-hour cycle is also very important. And I've seen recently papers looking at nighttime sleep, and as you know, it's divided into 4 stages, and the stage 4 is called the rapid eye movement sleep or the dream sleep, and it's completely obliterated when we expose people to electromagnetic fields. And that's scary because these dream sleep periods during the night are the periods when your body is supposed to repair itself. And now we come to this year's Nobel Prize in Chemistry which was partly awarded to a Swedish professor, Thomas Lindahl, who has been looking exactly at these DNA damage and repair cycles. And I am trying to reach him. I will try to write to him, because I want to know what he has seen using ionizing radiation as a damaging tool. Could that be mimicked using non-ionizing radiation? And I already know the answer, because that's one of the areas which has been most replicated, and you have very steady knowledge. And again, the initial study is from American scientist Professor Henry Lai and his co-worker Narendra Singh in Seattle, United States. So this is a very, very important area to pursue further. And I wish we could do more. I always feel bad, because many intelligent and clever persons like yourself, they're asking these very important questions, and I would love to be able to sort of say, oh, I run to the laboratory immediately. But nowadays, and since many years back, it's very difficult to get any form of funding. And I have even written to the Swedish government asking them to send the documentation giving the clear green light, saying that it is completely safe. And so far, after many years, I haven't got a single sentence, not the word, not the period, not the comma, nothing. Because I think, you know, if it is safe, then I want to go somewhere else in society and help other people with other functional impairments or diseases or problems. But I get nothing.
That sounds very frustrating.
It is.
We have an expression here in the United States that the canary, the bird, just warns us of danger. What is it in our bodies that is that canary in the coal mine? Is it the skin changes, the increases in cancer, the allergies, immune system responses, or is it now the electro-hypersensitivity issue?
Or is it all of it, actually, you know? I always tell people that we should be very happy that we have the persons with electro-hypersensitivity, because they really tell us that something is wrong. And it was also partly the basis for giving or recognizing them here in Sweden as a functional impairment or disability, because such a recognition puts the blame not on the person but on the environment. And as you say, something is wrong in the coal mine. The yellow canary birds fell off their sticks and died because the air was not good enough. And then the miners knew they had to surface as quick as possible. And maybe we need to surface in the same way, and we should really be happy that they are telling us that something is wrong. And then, not so nice, of course, on top of that, you have all these cancers, diabetes, allergies, asthmas, and so on. I mean, like in Sweden, more than 50% of children up to the age of 14 have asthma, allergy, or some other form of oversensitivity. It's just a scandal, to say the least, you know. And for the whole population, all age intervals, it's more than a third. We have also more than a third that have severe sleeping problems, etc., etc., etc. And I'm not, again, ruling out other confounding factors, but with all this published information, shouldn't we react? And especially the big mama and the big papa, namely our governments and parliaments and the health authorities, shouldn't they really put a moratorium on this? And I also said it's high time to start developing tomorrow's green human-friendly technology. And so far, there are only a few countries, like Spain, for instance, but above all, Norway, they are very interested in relocating their huge profits from the oil and gas industry into other areas. And one such area is human-friendly technology of various types. So maybe soon in the future, we will not buy mobile phones from Motorola or Ericsson or Nokia. They will all be called Norwegian.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know that. There was a book in the early, since you brought up the possibility of some of the problems being created by other things in the environment other than the electromagnetic radio frequencies. There was a book in the early 2000s by, and excuse me if I don't pronounce her name correctly, a book by...
Could I stop you? You are breaking up terribly. It's impossible to hear you.
Okay.
Could you start again?
Yes. You brought up the issue of possible other things in the environment.
Yes.
There was a book in the early 2000s by Guni Nordstrom, a Scandinavian journalist. She wrote about the dangers of environmental illness caused by electromagnetic fields and chemical emissions. And that is being one reason why she believed those combined exposures, and also the fact that we weren't paying attention to that, was one of the reasons why we moved the manufacture of mobile phones and computers to Asia, where they're not so possibly strict about paying attention to those types of emissions, the chemicals used to make those products and that are contained in those products. He was warning us about a synergistic negative effect, a combined effect of the electromagnetic frequencies with chemicals. So, do we know, are the people who have been exposed to certain chemicals more electro-hypersensitive, or do the electromagnetic radio frequencies make us more susceptible to the chemicals and toxins, or is it both or all scenarios?
To begin with, I would like to say that Gunni Nordström, who is nowadays a retired writer and author of several books and more than 100 excellent articles, she's one of the top journalists ever, together with her colleague Carl von Scheele, and they have written a number of articles and books, and she has done a tremendous job. And she also got interested, as you say, in the combination between environmental chemicals, for instance, flame retardants, and then electromagnetic fields. And that was based upon brilliant work by a professor in England, Dennis Henshaw, and his co-workers, that showed that these chemicals are being moved in electromagnetic field differences. And that means that when you sit in front of a visual display terminal or computer screen, or use a mobile phone or a tablet, maybe you're actually much more exposed to these chemicals because they are concentrated. And many of these plasticizers and flame retardants and other chemicals, they are very well known as being mutagenic, carcinogenic, allergogenic, and so on. So they are bad for you. And as you say, it's just too little known here. Much more needs to be done regarding investigations. And I'm sorry that Gunni Nordström is retired, because she has always behaved like a professor, I would say.
I noticed in the abstract of the recent 5th Paris Appeal Congress that you attended in Brussels, Belgium in May, that in the conferences on the electromagnetic fields and the chemicals, there was a fellow conference expert, a dentist from Iran, who said there's an increased release of mercury from the fillings, the dental amalgams in our teeth, after exposure to electromagnetic fields generated by the phones and also by MRI machines. Then, similarly, there was another scientist talking about dental implants amplifying the EMF exposures in our jaw area and possible our cranial nerves. So I'd like to ask you, if I put my glasses on, should I be concerned? Are our metal devices, such as jewelry, the glasses, the silver fillings, the gold crowns, the metals in the tattoo inks, medical implants, are these acting like an antenna that are attracting more of the electromagnetic radio frequencies to us?
They are acting as antennas. That doesn't mean that they attract more, but they will be dissolved and altered. And this is actually quite an old knowledge. The first studies, they were done in Sweden on professional divers that lost their tooth fillings because they used tools that produced high levels of power frequent magnetic fields. And one could easily understand that these coils had then formed fields that corroded the metal dental implants. And that goes for any such material in your glasses or inside your body, that they will be affected by these electromagnetic fields. And there has been quite a few studies throughout the years clearly showing this. And I mean, if it's just the corrosion, okay then, but the corrosion products like mercury could then act as a very active poison in your body, and that is definitely not something you would like to have there. So again, I don't know the English expression for that, but in Sweden we say that you jump out of one boiling pot into another one, you know, even hotter than before. And you do it because society is moving forward, things are being developed, everything should be nice, easy, happy, fun, you know, but maybe by doing all these inventions and manufacturing and selling them, we are selling potentially very dangerous exposures, direct exposures to not only human beings, but of course to all living creatures on the planet.
Can you tell me, what is there something about our bodies that allows us to attract or absorb the electromagnetic radio frequencies? Is it our high water content, our bones, the magnetic minerals like iron, copper, the charged particles in our bodies? What is it about us humans that makes us susceptible?
I don't think we are more susceptible than anyone else. Bacteria, plants, insects, birds, other types of animals, etc., we are equally susceptible to it, and we are built of the same type of molecules, same type of cells. And your question is very, very important. Unfortunately, as a scientist, we still don't have a clear-cut answer, but there are a number of molecules that can act in themselves as antennas, for instance. We have ionic flows across cell membranes that could be of interest. And again, I want to point out Professor Henry Lai in Seattle. He has done a number of very important studies showing alterations, changes, transports, etc., a lot of different molecules in our body when he subjects experimental animals to exposures, including, for instance, transmitter molecules. And it's interesting to see that when test persons are exposed, for instance, to mobile telephony or frequent magnetic fields, you see very clear-cut changes in the electric pattern of the brain, the so-called EEG, and you see changes in transmitter transport and ionic channels opening and closing, and so on, you know. And also you can see in behavioral experiments a decrease in concentration capacity, decrease in short-term memory, a decrease in learning capacity, and etc. So maybe these fun things that allows us to communicate right now, actually, maybe they are at the same time dumbing us down, at least to a certain degree.
I think I'd probably agree with that. Can you tell me what the purpose or goal of that 5th Paris Appeal Congress was? Has the World Health Organization yet answered or addressed the concerns of your May 2015 meeting?
Well, I have to surprise you because I was at the conference. I participated as a lecturer there, but I could not sign their appeal because the appeal wanted to go against people with electrohypersensitivity. You know, they are recognized as a disability or functional impairment, but the appeal wants to instead give them a status of being patients with a diagnosis and some kind of treatment. Treatment I don't even know what it's all about. And I couldn't sign such an appeal because the Swedish recognition of electrohypersensitivity puts the entire blame on the environment. It's the environment who should have an international code of diagnosis. It's the environment that should be treated. And the treatment is very simple, and you have already touched upon that. It's what I would call electrosanitation, meaning shielding and or distance to source of exposure. And of course, don't get me wrong, a person with a functional impairment in Sweden or anywhere else within the United Nations countries is of course allowed to go to a doctor. An electrohypersensitive person may have a headache and want to have a prescription for aspirins, and naturally they can do that. And already the year 2000 they got an ICD code classification based upon the symptoms. So it's no problem, but the culprit is and will always be the environment. And with this Fifth Paris appeal, I just could not sign it. That I cannot really answer. I have no insight into where it's going and what it's doing. And I also see that many electrohypersensitive persons and their relatives around the planet are upset because they don't want to be sent into a corner as patients. And you know, from a legal point of view, being a patient, then you are half a micron away of being a psychiatric patient. But if you have a functional impairment recognition, that's the largest legal umbrella anyone can have on this planet, and they are completely protected against any such attacks. And therefore, I'm not surprised that people with electrohypersensitivity, that they are upset at this moment. Okay,
thank you. Is one of your goals at this point to have the World Health Organization reclassify mobile phone radiation from a class 2B carcinogen, meaning possibly carcinogenic, to a stricter classification such as 2A, a probable carcinogen, or higher? What would you like to see?
Well, at this point, I still think 2B is enough. It sends a message good enough to society that these gadgets are not safe. The knowledge regarding 2A or 1 classification is still lacking, but on the other hand, if we move away from my dry scientific look upon this and just talk about moral and ethical issues and the fact that we are talking about toys, I would favor a class 1 classification, definitely. Because, you know, and again, Americans, you have the saying that it's better to be safe than sorry. The other opposite outcome to have people getting brain tumors or childhood leukemia in the future, it's not very tempting at all.
Okay, I believe in the past lecture you mentioned safe distance from a mobile phone is 5 to 10 kilometers, which here in the United States would be about 3 to 6 miles. Do you still believe that, or would you increase the distance now?
You're breaking up again, but I think you asked about the distance to radiation sources. And at the meeting 1998, that's a long time ago, in Göteborg on the west coast of Sweden, and I believe it was a meeting for like 3-4 days, including Professor Henry Lai and other world experts. I remember I asked a very similar question to a physicist, having heard all the presentations of biological and medical effects, and then I said, hey, if we buy a mobile phone and a hands-free gadget, how far away from our body do we need to put it to be on the safe side? And then he said exactly like this, well, Olle, it's hard to give an exact figure, but it would probably be enough to put it away 5 to 10 kilometers. You know, a mobile phone is an extremely strong radiation source. You have to remember that the microwave exposures from a 3G, the third generation mobile phone, compared to a natural background is a quintillion times higher. That's a 1 with 18 zeros behind. So it's an enormous radiation source. And therefore, I do understand that this physicist was correct. And then I remember I was in a radio interview in Sweden a few weeks after that, and I mentioned this figure. And the day after, a teacher in high school physics called me and said that that was the most stupid thing he had ever heard. He had calculated that it was enough with 500 to 1,000 meters. And then I still said, what's the beef? How long arms do you have? How should you be able to dial the number, you know? And then he just hang up, being really angry with me.
Similarly, in 1997, 18 years ago, you said there's only one hygienic safety value of electromagnetic radiation.
Yes.
0.0000001 watts per square meter. The natural background during cosmic activities. What does that mean? Like the way we lived before we became to put electricity in our homes? Can you explain?
Yeah, you know, the public exposure recommendation in the United States is 10 million microwatts per square meter. If you divide that figure with the figure you mentioned, then you get the difference between artificial radiation, microwave exposure, and the natural background, and that's in the order of a quintillion times. And therefore, 1997, at the trade union meeting in Stockholm, in a small room, I remember, with just a few people, I said that it was high time to introduce what we in Sweden would call a hygienic safety level instead of a recommendation or guideline. And I said only the natural background could be regarded as a safe exposure. And in this room was one of my most harsh opponents present. And he said the following, and I quote, "I never trust what Olle Johansson says, but this time he is completely right."
Well, isn't that reassuring?
It is. And I was kind of flabbergasted, you know, to hear him speak out in such an honest way and say that, yes, you are so completely right in this. And that was 1997, you know. We are talking about the first and second generation wireless systems. Today we have added so many more systems of various types, so many more gadgets, and especially children has been given, for good reasons, for kind reasons, more and more exposure. And it's kind of, from a moral and ethical point of view, very odd that parents, at least in Sweden, they are forced to send their children to schools that are wirelessly based, meaning that they expose the children to something that the World Health Organization already cancer classified 2011, and for the power frequent fields 2001. So it's fantastic, because just imagine if these schools would be filled with cigarette smoke. No mother and father in Sweden would send them there, you know, but they are filled, and to a biblical proportion, with invisible non-ionizing radiation of the very same type that harms anything from bacteria, tomato plants, ants, honeybees, mice, rats, and so on, all the way up to human beings, and no one seems to react.
So is there a safe place with no electromagnetic radio frequencies, or has that option disappeared due to our global satellites and all our devices?
Well, I mean, there are, of course, safer places, And if you, for instance, buy a mine that is not used any longer and live in it, or you buy a Faraday cage or some other similar installation, or if you move to Sweden actually, because Sweden, as huge parts of the United States, is extremely isolated. No one is living in the forests, only moose and reindeer and that kind of thing. And the operators, they don't burn money, so they don't expose these vast areas. And there you have what we in Sweden call environmental refugees, people that cannot live in the modern society, and they have had to leave it, and they live like in caravans, tents, huts, whatever, and far, far away from any modern facilities and modern shops and whatever you need. And fortunately, there are not very many in Sweden. Based on a population of a little bit more than 9 million, they form a group of around 800. And right now, there's a huge debate in Sweden because Sweden is invaded, I would say, with refugees from Syria and Iraq and so on. And they're coming in the hundreds of thousands. And people are asking questions, how should we be able to take care of them and so on. And I couldn't help myself thinking, wow, should they end up as these environmental refugees in a snow-covered caravan 200 kilometers from the nearest food shop?
Yeah, yes, you brought up a very, very disconcerting problem, the refugees. We're very upset, many of us here in the United States, about that too, even though it may appear that we don't seem compassionate at times. I wanted to ask you also, on the horizon, do you know if industry is perhaps developing safer tech frequencies that may be more compatible with our physiology?
I couldn't say I know they are doing it, but I'm sure they are trying to. And, sometimes huge international corporations are starting garages in California. So why not again? Why not some young women and men sitting in a garage somewhere inventing a new tool for long-distance telecommunication, whatever it will be, but in a green, human-friendly format? And I'm pretty sure that the industry is already trying to do something similar. But at the same time, I guess if I was the head of Motorola or Nokia or Ericsson or something, I would feel pretty safe, because they have handed all the responsibility from a legal point of view to governments and parliaments, and the governments and parliaments still say, yes, we want to have more, and they don't pay any attention to experts such as Sam Ilham, yourself, Henry Lai, and so forth. And that could be a huge mistake to turn your back upon such a very poisonous snake.
Okay, I believe I may be close to my time limit here.
Yes, you are. Yeah, yes, you are.
Yes, I wanted to ask you one last thing. At this point, after your long career at the Karolinska Institute, is there something that you still wish to accomplish, or is there something that you're working on that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, I mean, the wishes I have for the few years remaining of my life is, of course, that I'm completely wrong. I wish that all the things we talk about will vanish, and it turns out that if neutral and does nothing. But as I said before, that would be sensational, because every day in my computer there are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 new publications of high quality and very important results, adding to the previous 25,000 papers. So the probability for my wish to come true is very nil, I would say. And apart from that, I just wish you a very nice continuous day in sunny Florida.
Thank you very much, and enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. And I believe we'll conclude. Thank you.